I'm glad that Phil clarified exactly who that picture is of, in case you thought it was me during perhaps one of my rougher mornings. That of course is Alexander Dugin. I'm also going to chat a little bit about Wang, Huning, who's I think equally as influential in a Chinese context as Dugan is in a Russian context. So what I want to do over the next sort of 30 to 35 minutes, possibly 40 if any of you can stand it, is to use these two very different thinkers to look at the ways in which the seeming ideological and perhaps deeper still cultural challenge mounted by Russia and China to the West, to the liberal modernity embodied and championed by the West, draws, I think, to a large extent from the cultural discontent and deepening intellectual crises within the West itself. Or to put it another way, both Chinese and Russian ruling elites' critique, if you like, of Western liberal modernity, a modernity appropriated by and embodied by the West, has been generated by and within the development of Western modernity itself. So the contention that individualism and individual freedom perhaps has gone too far, that the historical emancipation of people from subservience to God, from strict hierarchical sort of tradition-bound societies has led to a nihilistic kind of consumerist decadence. And I want to suggest that all this kind of doubt, this discontent, this loathing of the West's has its roots, I think, largely in the West itself. Now, I'm going to do this in two parts. One, the first part looking at the youthful gentleman picture, Dugin, and the other on Wang, largely because they're such different thinkers and they're operating in entirely different contexts. So first up, Alexander Dugin. Now, put your hands up, any of you who are kind of vaguely familiar with Alexander Dugin. Christ, that's a worryingly large number. Now, there's a lot of speculation about Dugin's political influence over the Kremlin and over Putin in particular. Some cast him as Putin's brain, which sounds like a thoroughly unpleasant organ to be. Some sort of cast him as the man behind the invasion of Ukraine because he's consistently dismissed its existence, for the past 20, 30 years, because he championed the 2014 invasion of Ukraine, famously urging Russian separatists to kill in the Donbass, which didn't go down particularly well. So there are grounds for this idea of Dugin almost semi-urging on the invasion of Ukraine. Others, on the other hand, dismiss Dugin as little more than a kind of an alt-right pin-up, just with an incredible beard. And I think both miss the point, probably. Not about the beard, it is it's a thing to behold, it's a work of art. No, I think they missed the point about Dugin's influence. I think Dugan is best understood as an ideologue. He's someone who sought to provide, over the course of the past 20, 30 years, sought to provide Russian elites with a narrative about Russia's future, about its national, indeed sort of quasi-imperial mission. As he put it when he founded his Eurasia movement, and Eurasianism is a key part of Dugin's thought, as he put it when he founded the Eurasia movement in 2001, our aim is not to achieve power, nor to fight for power, it's to achieve influence on it. In fact, I'd suggest that almost by looking at Dugin himself, you can gain a certain amount of insight into the phenomenon of Russian nationalism, which, as we know, has become an increasingly sort of geopolitically significant factor certainly in the past year. He also allows us, I think, to trace the evolution of Russian nationalist thought as one of its most active proponents over the past 20 to 30 years. In his writings, media appearances, frontline broadcasts, he cropped up in the 2008 war in Georgia, just sort of standing behind Russian troops, championing, urging them on. He's like the Gary Lineker of, kind of Putinism. I think Dugin captures and expresses the development of Russian nationalism. He shows how it's tied up first and foremost now with a deep loathing of the West. In fact, in many ways, anti-Westernism is almost inseparable right now from Russian nationalism. And in Dugin's work and his growing influence, he demonstrates how this sense of nationalist grievance, this sense of kind of Russian nationalist resentment develops quickly after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. First with the expansion, I guess, of the disastrous sort of neoliberal shock therapy of the 1990s. He also captures and gives expression, of course, to the humiliation felt by Russian elites as the great power status of Russia evaporates during the 1990s. And Dugin does something very useful for the Russian elites. He tells them why it's gone wrong. And he tells them effectively that the future will be different. And the future will be different, Dugan argues, because Russia is different. It's a distinct, sort of ethnic entity. It has almost like a racial soul. It has this essential spirit. It can never actually, and it should never have attempted to be westernized or integrated into the globalist network. All that is like an inauthentic imposition on Russia. Russia, he argues, has a different destiny in which it will realise its essence, which in turn will pose a cultural challenge and an alternative to Western hegemony. Now, just a bit of background for those who are perhaps not as well aware of Dugin as the significant number seemingly are. He was born in 1962. He's the descendant of a long line of Russian military officers, which is perhaps telling in itself. He was a precocious, rebellious youth, a prodigious linguist, which I think is important because it's enabled him to seek out and engage with potential anti-Western allies throughout the world, from Iran to Kazakhstan to the French National Front. He's at home in all sorts of kind of anti-Western contexts. Now, Dugan from the start, he was no fan of Soviet Russia. He was no fan of the kind of stifling conformity of life in Soviet-era Russia. As a teenager, during his 20s, he sought refuge, I think, in a dissident Bohemia of late 1970s, 1980s Moscow. He hung out in the notorious Uzinsky circle, pursuing kind of transcendental experiences through orgies, drugs, drink, a little bit of Satanism. Fair enough, we've all been young once, I guess. But it's at this point, of course, where he comes into contact with traditionalism, which is the body of thought that will effectively dominate and shape his worldview. And it's also what gives his Russian nationalism its almost apocalyptic, eschatological feel. Now, traditionalism was I want to say philosophy. It was a kind of quasi-philosophy. It was as much a kind of sentiment as much as anything else. Developed by a Frenchman called René Guénon during the interwar years and politicised and kind of made fascist by Julius Evola in the 1930s. Traditionalism's basic contention is this, that the world's major religions contain traces of this kind of original sacred tradition, which is, many millennia in the past. And this tradition, this sacred tradition, provided men with the social and religious principles by which to live. They effectively lived in the truth. Millennia ago, people lived in the truth. They lived as how they ought to live. And traditionalists argue that with the advent of modernity, people have fallen away from the truths of revealed religion, and they've fallen away, of course, from this kind of sacred tradition. They've lost even a memory of what it might be like to live in the truth. They've lost themselves. They've become lost. They become slaves instead to reason, to materialism, indeed to themselves. They've become estranged from the truth. So modernity in the traditionalist reading is cast not as the story of man's emancipation, of progress and so on. It's cast as the story of man's fall. Now, Guénon opts to pursue a kind of solipsistic kind of meditation kind of route. He's more like a proto-hippie as much as anything else. And Evola opts, of course, kind of for the kind of revolutionary conservatism of fascism. And all this resonates with the young Dugin. It provides him with a critical perspective on communist Russia, which he sees as just one species of kind of fallen modernity. And it also provides him with a reason to loathe the West itself. Now, I think at this stage, then, it's important to note that traditionalism, which is almost at the root of, which gives shape to Dugin's critique of the West, is very much a critique of modernity, a critique of liberalism, of democracy, of all the aspects of modernity that we associate with it. It's very much a critique generated in the West, in the crisis years after the First World War. It's of a piece with much of modernist art and philosophy, with modernist avant-gardes, with futurism, with fascism to an extent, with the conservative revolution with a capital C and capital R, and so on. And what's fascinating about Dugan during the 1990s, actually, is how he combines this incredibly Western critique of modernity developed, 50, 60 years before Dugan was using it in the 1990s. How he uses this product of kind of European bourgeois reaction of deep disillusionment during the interwar years. The sense that liberalism, that laissez-faire capitalism, they're illegitimate, they're no longer fit for purpose. And he combines this with Russian nationalism. That is, he effectively argues that it is Russia's role, its destiny, even, to challenge and overthrow the decadent, nihilistic liberalism of the West. He effectively turns Russia into a vehicle for a Western critique of modernity. And how does he do this? He does this because he combines it with this phenomenon called Neo-eurasianism. Now, Eurasianism, as in Eurasia, Eurasianism was originally a kind of scholarly and political enterprise pursued by a group of Russian exiles and dissidents during the 1920s. They were opponents of the Bolsheviks and opponents of the West. They were kind of reactionary, conservative types. And they set about uncovering the kind of the ancient cultural and ethnic basis for a Eurasian civilization which traversed the steppe and connected Russia with the East, and at certain points with Turkic people, at other points not Turkic people. Eurasia is a very kind of loose concept for this kind of large continental bloc. And the political objective, I think, of all this was to assert the distinctiveness of Russia, its imperial breadth, if you like, as the centre of this Eurasian civilization. And like the kind of pan-Slavic movement before it, to unearth the cultural, racial, spiritual essence of Russia and Eurasia, which sets it apart from the West. Now, again, much of the inspiration for this movement came from, again, within the West. It comes from the Romantic, especially a sort of German Romantic opposition to Enlightenment universalism, to Enlightenment freedom, reason, and so on, articulated perhaps above all by thinkers like sort of Johann Gottfried Herder and so on. Now, this older Eurasianism, this Eurasianism which was developed during the 1920s and 30s, was taken up by a thinker called... This is the peril of doing a lecture about Russia-China, because my pronunciation of foreign names is positively racist. Now, this older Eurasianism was taken up by a thinker called, now correct me, Lev Gumilev. Lev Gumilev? Does that ring a bell? Lev Gumilev? Okay, I could call him anything I like, couldn't I, really? And you'd all be fantastic. That's exactly how it is. Lev Gumilev. Lev Gummy Bear. In the 1960s... Now, it was taken up by Lev Gumilev. He's actually incredibly influential in Russia. He really is, in the 1960s and 1970s. And he gave the whole Eurasian idea a real biologically determinist twist. The people of Eurasia, with the Russian people, or the Russian ethnos, which is what Gumilev calls a people, with the Russian ethnos chief among the people of Eurasia, leading them on, they embody and express a distinct shared biological essence, informed almost by the land itself. And interestingly, Gumilev's ethnology, it's basically a pseudoscience, has become much more popular at an institutional level in Russia during the 1990s and 2000s. It's been part of educational curricula and so on. But the point is that Dugin takes Eurasianism. He takes the idea that that Russia is a unique ethnos, a kind of culturally distinct people, this cultural essence which has just been flowing, should be flowing through them for millennia. A people whose destiny it is to be Eurasian, and he refracts this through his traditionalist lens. So Russia is not only a unique ethnos, a people whose destiny it is to be Eurasian, to lead a Eurasian civilization, to be a ruling group in this larger, basically quasi-imperialist bloc. Russia is also destined to challenge Western modernity. It's almost essentially destined to challenge Western modernity, to reverse the fall of man. And of course, at this point, he makes an appeal to Russian Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodox Church, hence the beautiful beard. And now, all this sounds a bit bonkers, but this vision of Russia as a distinct ethnos with a distinct spiritual essence and a mission to lead a Eurasian bloc in opposition to the West, all this starts to resonate at certain levels and in certain elements among Russian elites during the 1990s. And that's because, as I've suggested, it's developed in response to the grievances and the humiliations of the immediate post-Soviet years. The years when it became clear that the US, through NATO, was seemingly set on expanding. The years when it became clear that the rapid neoliberal privatization schemes of the 1990s, pushed by Yeltsin, Dugan hates Yeltsin, but pushed by Yeltsin, which was back to the hilt by first Bush and then Clinton, had benefited a few. We know them as the oligarchs, which makes them sound like an exciting 1960s band. The oligarchs at the expense of the many. Now, Russian elites felt humiliated and aggrieved by the West. And Dugin's thought, Dugin's development, and Dugin's increasing influence bears this out. He bears out the truth, effectively, the US diplomat George Kennan's warning about NATO expansion and general Western recklessness in the post-Soviet years. Because Kennan famously said it will inflame the nationalistic, anti-Western and militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion. And this this is what's going on. Dugan's almost fueled by that post-Soviet context, that sense of humiliation and grievance. So as bonkers as his ideas sound, there's a reason why they start to resonate. Dugan's work basically inflames and caters to those sentiments. It gives kind of Russian elites, they're feeling pretty aggrieved about how things have gone. It gives them a sense of release, a sense of hope in the shape of a Russian revival at the heart of this kind of new Eurasia. And the first result is a book called Foundation of Geopolitics, published in 1997, which Dugan wrote, incredibly enough, with the then Minister of Defence. So that shows how Russian elites are quite receptive to Dugan's thoughts, as bonkers as they are. And it even becomes like an official textbook for Russian army generals. And Foundation of Geopolitics, it actually sounds like quite a boring book. If you were given like a 600-page book with a Foundation of Geopolitics, you'd think, I might give that to someone else for Christmas. I think that's what you'd think. And it's quite a dry book. It references the big names of geopolitics. I'm looking at James Woodhouse here, including its founder, Halford Mackinder, and the likes of Nazi legal theorists, Carl Schmitt and so on. It talks of Russia as a large space, which is not particularly exciting, is it? It talks of Russia as a large space, a heartland, to use Mackinder's language, around which there should be gathered a rim of smaller but ethnically and culturally similar smaller nations. And it suggests that this Russian civilizational zone, again, Samuel Huntington is a key influence in 1990s, 2000s sort of Russian intellectual circles. A civilizational zone. And Russia should be a civilizational zone, and it should become a pole in a multipolar world. What makes it fascinating is that Russia's geopolitical role and power is not just founded on geography, on it being a large territory. The foundation of its geopolitical mission is grounded on something else, according to Dugan, on its cultural and near spiritual essence, which is also going to be its destiny. And this essence is not just unmodern, shot through as it is with references to Russian orthodoxy, strictly hierarchical sort of caste-formed societies. It is anti-modern. It's not just un-Western, it is anti-Western. So in the late 1990s, Dugan is effectively writing the script for Russia's rejection of Westernization, almost before it happens, because it is at odds with the nature and the destiny of the Russian ethnos, of the Russian and Eurasian people's cultural essence. And he's saying that it is effectively Russia's future, if it is true to itself as a spiritually distinct race, to assert itself as an anti-Western power. And deeper still, in accordance with Dugan's traditionalism, it is Russia's destiny to lead a global challenge to modernity to itself, to resist and defy the West, almost as a matter of philosophic imperative. Indeed, in his 2009 book, The Fourth Political Theory, he states that the entirety of Russian history is a dialectical argument with the West and against Western culture, the struggle for upholding our own, often only intuitively grasped Russian truth, our own messianic idea, and our own version of the end of history. And I should point out that the fourth political theory, Dugan's he's not unambitious, to be fair to him. The fourth political theory, after as Dugan puts it, liberalism, fascism and communism, is nothing less than Russian nationalism itself. This fourth political theory, this new ideology which will emerge if Russia returns to itself, returns to its kind of cultural, ethnic essence and discovers and asserts its own authentic way of being. Dugan's work at this point is shot through with the language of Martin Heidegger. If it's true to itself, true to its own authentic way of being, which happens to be a strictly hierarchical, collectivized society overseen by a spiritual elite and dominating the Eurasian region, if it's true to itself, everything will be great again, certainly in Russia. But as I said, the irony is that this assertion of Russian distinctness, this assertion of Russia's semi-imperial Eurasian mission, draws deeply not so much on Russian intellectual resources, on Russian sort of material or cultural strength, orthodoxy aside, but from criticism internal to Western modernity itself. And you can see that with traditionalism, with Eurasianism, which, as I say, drew a lot of force from the German Romantic opposition to Enlightenment universalism. In fact, Dugan's Russian nationalism is almost an explosive continuation of a strong tradition of counter-Enlightenment thought. And you can also see this in Dugan's parasitical relationship to modernity's discontents, most spectacularly in Dugan's use of postmodernism, and in the past couple of years, incredibly, what looks like wokeism. He uses postmodernity against the West. He rightly says that it is the liquidation of the program of the Enlightenment, and he thinks that's fantastic. That's what Dugan said. He represents the abandonment of postmodernity to Dugin, and I think it probably does, represents the abandonment of universalism, reason, truth, and even biological reality. Dugan is making fun of gender identity a good 10 years ago. Dugan argues that postmodernity shows that individuals in the West have been so thoroughly emancipated from any authority, tradition, God, that they now believe in nothing at all. The West is the height of nihilism, which for Dugan means that the end of the West and the end itself is getting closer. This one means it's apocalyptic, but there was something apocalyptic about Russian nationalism. And better still, Dugin absolutely revels in the deconstruction, in inverted commas, of ideas of progress, science, freedom and reason, which he says postmodernists, and he's happy they've done this, have exposed as veils for the exercise of Western imperialism, domination and the will to power. He even accuses the West of ethnocentrism and racism. There is no aspect of contemporary Western self-loathing, of its nihilistic renunciation of its own history, that Dugin won't use against it. Now, I need to stop the Dugan part of this, but you can have too much Dugan, I think. I think, to round it off, it's just important to note that Duganism, such as it is not championed by any one part of the nationalist spectrum. Dugan actually is, his thoughts too all over the place, really, to be easily incorporated into any kind of political party. Although he has had a hand in all sorts of political groupings, from the kind of national Bolsheviks of the 1990s to even the kind of revamped Communist Party. And it's also important to note that Dugan himself has not exactly embraced Duganism, but they have some sort of relationship. Dugan was very happy with Putin at one point, called him a Eurasian man. I think he invited him to be like the honorary president of the Eurasia movement. Dugan, I think Putin might have accepted, but then Dugan gets fed up with Putin because he's a bit too into buying things, he's a bit too liberal and so on. So he resents that. Putin is just not anti-Western enough for Dugan. Certainly not in the 2000s. The point is that Dugan's nationalism is, I think, possibly its most extreme and elaborate expression of the kind of post-Soviet nationalist phenomenon. And in his effort to give, and this is key, I think, and in his effort to give Russian nationalism some ideological substance beyond kind of simple sort of Peter the Great yearning, he unwittingly highlights its vacuity. That is, it is effectively an expression of Western anti-Westernism. Its roots lie, as I say, less in Russia itself than in a kind of long-standing critique of liberalism, of enlightenment, of modernity that has been thoroughly worked up in the West. Now, I'll move on to Wang Huning, just because I have to. He's a very, very different figure to Dugan, thank God. He's not a public intellectual. In fact, since the mid-1990s, he's stopped publishing, certainly in his own name, at any rate. Unlike Dugan, he does have a formally close relationship with President Xi Jinping, just as he had with Xi's predecessors, Jiang Zemin. Actually, I'm going to pronounce these names wrong, so please. Hu Jintao? Will that do? Thank you. Wang's a member of the CCP's, well, he is now, he's a member of the CCP's seven-man Politburo Standing Committee, and he's widely recognised, basically, as the kind of CCP's ideas man. Reports credit him with being behind some of Xi's key initiatives, from the China Dream project of 2012, even the Belt and Road Initiative, and even so-called Xi Jinping thought. But I think what's interesting from our perspective is the extent to which Wang is trying to fashion China's modernisation almost in response to what he sees as the failings of Western modernity, which, as we'll see, he saw at first hand in the late 1980s, which records it is actually a genuinely remarkable book called America Against America, and I would urge anyone to have a look at it. The only drawback is it's not really available through any official publisher. Amazon will provide you with a knockoff copy, but it has no page numbers, which anyone who's a fan of numeration might find that a bit of a drawback. Now, it wasn't always that way. Wang didn't always have an antagonistic relationship with the West. Wang wasn't, he's not like Dugin. He wasn't lying in his cradle just hating America and liberalism and freedom and, I hate it. Far from it. Born in 1955, he was, by all accounts, he was a kind of rather sort of sickly, bookish kid, really into French literature, of all things. And he benefited from the opening up of universities in China during the 1970s. He also benefited, I think, from Deng Xiaoping's liberalization of the Chinese economy and society, I think, during the 1970s and 80s. Wang manages to win a place at Fudan University. He's a prodigiously intelligent guy. He immersed himself in political theory, Socrates, Rousseau, Hegel, Marx. He was basically effectively enveloped in Western thought. He wrote his thesis on national sovereignty, and I think given some of the speeches yesterday, we should probably get Wang to talk at next year's Academy. But Wang's key concern, and is the reason why he becomes so important, was developing during the 70s and 1980s. And he was concerned about the role that culture, tradition and shared values plays in maintaining political stability, particularly during a period of significant political and social change, because that's what China was and still is going through. So in a famous 1988 essay called The Structure of China's Changing Political Culture, Wang started to voice concerns about the threat to political and social cohesion posed by the liberalization of China, by its modernization. He wrote that China was in a state of transformation, moving from an economy based on production to one based on consumption. And that was being accompanied by a deeper cultural change, he said, from a spiritually oriented culture to a materially oriented culture, and from a collectivist culture to an individualistic culture. And he warns there are no core values in China's most recent structure. He's worried and concerned about the development of China during a period of its increasingly rapid modernization. And so he says, we must create core values. That's what he was saying in 1988. We must create core values. We must combine the flexibility of China's traditional values with the modern spirit. And I think this is why Wang was to rise so rapidly through the CCP hierarchy during the 1990s and 2000s. His concerns over the threat to social and political cohesion posed by greater economic freedoms and increased levels of consumption and so on, by modernisation effectively, were effectively those of the CCP leadership. His worries about democratising China's social and political life too fast, opening up too fast, those were the same concerns as the CCP's leadership. And his anxiety about the baleful effects of modernity was also that of the CCP's leadership. And crucially, Wang could offer the CCP what those drenched in kind of Marxist, Leninist, Mao Zedong thought could not, namely a kind of non-bureaucratic, almost like West-oriented approach to the problem of accommodating the evolving ideas of sovereignty, democracy and the rule of law in China. Now, I think Xi's 2013 China Dream slogan, that kind of has Wang's fingerprints all over it. It was put forward after Xi became president in 2012 during a tour of the National Museum of China. Xi talked of China's proud historical heritage and talked about a great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Now, this future-oriented slogan, it's a future-oriented slogan, but also at the same time reaches back to Chinese history and culture. It was almost like an attempt, amid so much economic and social change, to kind of conjure up a kind of continuity. It was a vision of what China was, is, and wants to be, all in one. Now, crucially, I think this attempt to marshal China's rapid modernization, to manage the possible side effects, this emphasis on continuity and tradition, it comes, certainly where Wang is concerned, from the West, from what he sees as the failings of the West and the problems with Western modernity. The key moment in Wang's life and intellectual development is a months-long trip to America in the late 1980s. And the result is this book called America Against America. Now, what is striking about this book is the extent to which you can see how deeply, deeply impressed Wang is by America, by its level of material development, by the ability of a market economy, the ability of a market economy to create these kind of self-organizing spheres of activity of a complexity it would be impossible for a centralized administrative state to create. So he's not an enemy of America at all. He's not gone there like Dugan would go, I hate America. He's not an enemy of America in that way. In fact, he wants to know why this nation has risen to its position of global preeminence. And interestingly, this is fascinating, he suggests that it's partly due to America's strong sense of tradition. America's key values, he argues, individualism, freedom, democracy, equality, privacy hovers around there as well, and its practices, innovation, the sense that you have to struggle, sense of thrift even. They have such a grip, he says, on American citizens, and they've had such a grip on American citizens for so long, because they are, as he puts it, they're in the cultural gene. That's what he puts it. That's how he describes tradition. It's kind of this cultural genetic inheritance. It's passed on from one generation to the next as a set of beliefs, and it lends social life a kind of coherence and purpose. And Wang's impressed by how this nation with so little history, which is America, makes so much of what it has, so much of the history it has. He visits a museum dedicated to the Mayflower, which brought settlers to America's shores, I think, in the early 17th century. And he's deeply moved by it. He calls these monuments to America's past, which he sees littering the landscape, he calls them physical textbooks. He agrees with Samuel Huntington that America has a creed: freedom, individualism, democracy, equality. And he argues that that lends American society, otherwise so innovative, so concerned with modernizing, with always creating anew, with invention, a continuity. And he writes, societies that keep realizing the same creed as opposed to societies that keep changing their creed have a continuity of social development whose efficacy cannot be ignored. And this idea, I think, will start to inform his approach to China's modernization. Now, as an example of the role that tradition plays in the political sphere, he notes the way America handles the transfer of power, which he notes is historically a source of much conflict in society. It's not easy to pass power on, he's saying. And he draws attention to the tradition that underpins and underwrites the transfer of power in America, with incoming and outgoing presidents swearing, oath of allegiance on the same Bible that George Washington did. And he writes, tradition becomes the only thing modern people can rely on. It is that which a people has in common. It's that which unites them. He even writes that tradition is more powerful than law, as he puts it, because law is written in words and the other is written in people's beliefs. And again, you can see how that will start to inform his approach to certain cultural policies in China, which have recently kind of emphasised tradition, which have emphasised this sense of continuity, emphasised the need to adhere to certain shared values. Now, there's lots of criticism of America in America against America. He draws attention to the commodification of everything, including sex. He points out the domination of the power elites and the often undemocratic nature of American democracy. He's horrified by the homelessness. He's struck by the persistent racism and so on. But what really troubles him about America is that it is coming into contradiction with itself. That its core value actually of individualism, and with it individual freedom and privacy, they are coming into conflict with tradition itself. He notes how individualism is helping to undermine, as he puts it, the main cell through which tradition is passed on, namely that of the family. Old people, he writes, is kind of sequestered away in retirement villages or care homes, and young people are often shut in their rooms from an early age. Their privacy considered sacrosanct. So he suggests almost like this broader societal atomization is being bred within the family unit itself. Generations are not interacting. He writes, the fragmentation of the family has deprived society of many human feelings, which is also detrimental to a harmonious society. And this is interesting. He's basically saying that individualism, which at one time is this core value of America, which is part of the tradition which unites it, is at the same way eating away at its unity. It's eating away at the social fabric. It is preventing, as he says, basic knowledge and even the tradition in which individualism is venerated and esteemed from being passed on. And he says the rise of neoconservatism, and he's thinking here actually of Alan Bloom, suggests that this concern has reached considerable proportions. And then to finish America against America, he concludes actually with a little commentary on Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind. And like Bloom, he worries that individualism is creating a moral crisis. It's generating a moral crisis. And he starts to sound a little bit like Dugin now. He suggests that it's generating nihilism, that young people increasingly believe in nothing at all, that relativism prevails, that there is no truth but your own, which might as well not be any truth at all. And he writes, the existence and functioning of any social system can never be validated by the letter of the law alone. It is first and foremost a matter of people believing in these fundamental values and being guided by them in the way they behave. If the value system collapses, how can the social system be sustained? And he concludes, the whole system will fall into chaos and moral crisis. Chaos and moral crisis. That's where he sees America heading. And I think this is crucial to grasp in the context of Wang's influence on China's development. America, as he sees it, the very embodiment of Western modernity, is being undone by the nihilistic rejection of tradition fostered by too much individualism. And this haunts Wang's imagination. And that's why during the 1990s he's so concerned about too much, there being too much economic and social liberalism, that things are being liberalised too quickly, that too much freedom, if you like, is being injected into the Chinese bloodstream. There is, as Wang sees it, a need for the propagation of core values for what look, and that almost looks like cultural social engineering, so as to maintain social stability, or else China, like America, could start sliding into chaos and moral crisis. Right, that's it. So, no, it's not. Actually, it's nearly at the end. So, as I say, so he's worried that China could head the same way as he sees America going, into chaos and moral crisis. And I think this is useful to almost understand what we understand by the Chinese Communist Party's authoritarian rule in China. It's almost like authoritarian challenge to Western democracy, if we're to accept that it's kind of, at some level, kind of authored by Wang. And it's to be understood almost as a response to the failures of Western modernity. And that's almost where it's drawing its kind of moral energy from the failures of Western modernity. Now, I hope that I've been just able to hint at, without having kind of proved the thesis, hint at the fact that these kind of ideological, indeed cultural challenges mounted against the West by China and Russia, in their own very different ways draw very deeply on the problems, crises and critiques of modernity generated in and by the West itself. And that the deeper the crises and the greater actually probably the self-loathing, the more pronounced and stronger that challenge will become. And that really is it.